Welcome back. This is Stoicon-X Orlando 2021. And now we've got our next speaker, Tim Iverson.
Great to see everybody today, and always kind of pray to get through this tech part of our presentation, but I think we've made it. I was guiding my group on Wednesday and had a little snafu. So Stoic Dan and my friend Gabe got me through that crisis. But so I think we're good. Here we go. So glad to be here today. And I want to thank Stoic Dan for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be part of the Orlando Stoics. My name is Tim Iverson, and I am a co-organizer and presenter with the Minnesota Stoics, and I think my friend Gabriel is on the line too. So shout out to Gabe, who's also a co-presenter there. All right, just a bit about myself so you know who is speaking today. As I said, I'm a facilitator for the Minnesota Stoics. I'm a retired teacher and artist. I was in the public schools in Minnesota for 3 decades and retired a couple years ago. My main subject area were art and humanities, and you can see this is a sketch I did of my Aunt Lila and her dog here. So I'm a figurative artist as well as a humanities teacher. And I was very fortunate. I had a great principal who allowed me some latitude in what I taught, and I developed a curriculum and a program for middle school students, and I called it Philosophy for Beginners, which I taught for about 20 years. And it was a true joy. And I got to pick the brains of young people and allow them to express themselves in a somewhat rational fashion, I hope. And we also were inundated with the Oreo cookies and the Kool-Aid. But other than that, it was a great time. And we spent a lot of time writing essays and just sharing our thoughts. So that was a true joy. I am a former writer for The Artist magazine, where I was also a contributing editor. And a couple years ago, I collaborated on this project, a book called Educating Mindfully by the Coalition of Schools Educating Mindfully. So for the last 10 years of my career, I got quite involved in the mindfulness and education movement, where I shared mindfulness practices in my classroom and my school, and eventually served on a board, a national board called the Mindfulness and Education Network, where we helped young people develop those self-regulation skills. And shout out if there's any teachers out there, because I got to jump off the ship right before the pandemic. So I have extra, speaking of compassion, for my colleagues who are teaching over Zoom. That has to be a very challenging task. So shout out to all those educators and parents. All right. You know, I would like to start. I often in my classroom started with a mindful moment. Kids would come streaming through the door, pretty crazy. And we developed at my school mindful moments that we could do to help kids kind of self-regulate and get focused. So if we could do that today too, we're going to get a lot of text and ideas coming at us. And I would like to take just a moment to kind of touch in with the present moment. And I'm going to call this mindful moment the common breath. And briefly, on Wednesday, my friend Gabe was, or a couple Wednesdays ago, was leading us through the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And in book 6, he uses a phrase called the common breath. And this kind of reminds me of what Brittany was talking about. And, you know, in some religious traditions, the breath is considered kind of a divine spark. The Greeks called it the pneuma. I think that in Latin, it's called the spiritus. In this, Gabe might have to help me, but Hebrew, the ruach. And maybe you're more of a secular Stoic and you think of the breath as just this exchange of oxygen with the troposphere. But in any event, we share a common breath. So whether you're in Florida or Minnesota like me, or in another country, we are all inhaling and exhaling with the atmosphere. So let's go ahead and do that and just take a few breaths and enjoy a few moments of mindfulness together. Thank you. Let's take one more inhale and exhale. and just appreciating the fact that most of the time our body knows how to do this amazing activity called breathing. And we could even call it the logos that knows how to do that. It's a miracle. So thank you for sharing that mindful moment with me. All right, so brief overview of my presentation today. We'll have a little introductory, a few remarks. I'm going to talk about the concept of thrownness from Martin Heidegger, who was a phenomenologist and existential philosopher. And then we'll talk about the Stoic view of choice. And I'll give a little shout out to Brittany Polat, because I was inspired a ways back by her article on modern Stoicism, where she wrote about choice very nicely. So thanks for that, Brittany. We're going to briefly look at some models of the mind and brain. And then we're going to talk about a psychiatrist named William Glasser and his choice theory, who made a big impact on popular psychology. And then we're going to talk about changing the channel, a bit about mindfulness, or the Greek term is prosoke. So there's our overview. Oh, we're going to back up here. So I'm going to start with this artwork, which was by the American artist Winslow Homer. And I showed this in my classroom many years. I even showed it at a staff meeting one time, and it became kind of a meme in my classroom. It's a beautiful painting called The Gulf Stream. And when I looked at this painting many years ago, it kind of struck me that there's certainly a narrative or a story here that Winslow Homer is, there's a gentleman, he's out sailing. It appears that he's had some difficulty. There's a storm. If this was in my classroom, I would ask someone to describe it very carefully using objective language. But as this is a one-person presentation, I'll go ahead and just kind of do that. And you see there are sharks in the foreground. There are waves. There's a typhoon in the background. Basically, this person is in a bad way. And so it became a metaphor for those challenges, those difficulties that we all are going to face in life. Now, for some people, of course, the difficulties are going to be greater than others. There's no doubt about that. But we are all going to face circumstances that are beyond our control. Now, Martin Heidegger came along. He was a German philosopher, and he developed this concept called thrownness. And it's very interesting. So the basic idea is that as human beings, we are kind of thrown into this life. And we become conscious. We look around and we go, oh, I was born in this culture. I've got these parents. Excuse me. Maybe, I've got this cultural baggage. Maybe I have a genetic disease or some kind of physical problem. And so then life requires us to respond in some way. And we have to develop the capacity to be resilient. And so to come back to the picture here, we've got this man on the boat here. And I would ask my students, well, tell me about his reaction here. And they would say, well, it seems kind of strange. He's clearly in some kind of danger, and yet he looks very laid back. And so then it was my opportunity to introduce the idea, well, do you know what a Stoic is? And I would explain what that meant, at least briefly. And I would ask them, is this person a Stoic? And they would say, yeah, he seems to be very laid back. And he's kind of, we were talking about acceptance a moment ago. He seems to have accepted his fate, at least for the time being. He's paying no attention to the sharks. He's paying no attention to the typhoon behind him. He seems to be very laid back. Anyway, that's one interpretation. The point of the picture is that as Stoics, we care less about the sharks and the waves than we do about our response to those circumstances. Now, just as a little side note, teachers don't know it all. And I certainly learned throughout my career. And if you look on the horizon up here in the background, you will see a ship. Maybe the ship represents the change of his fate. But a student noticed that I had not seen that in the 10 years I had been teaching this image. But perhaps his fate was about to change with that boat on the horizon there. So, all right. So let's look at what the Stoics had to say about the power of choice. Epictetus from his discourses, you can bind up my leg, but not even Zeus has the power to break my freedom of choice. So we know a little bit about Epictetus. that he was a Roman, he was a slave at the beginning of his life. Apparently he got into some kind of conflict with his master who broke his leg or maimed him. And yet he chose to focus on the freedom that he still had in spite of those circumstances. And he went on to become one of the greatest teachers of all time. Okay, so some key points I want to make sure we get across today. Choice or volition, will, is essential to our makeup as human beings. We may have more choice in some realms than others. Even in difficult circumstances, we still have many options. We have choices about how to relate to difficult thoughts and emotions. So those choices apply not only to the grocery store or to our career, they also apply to how we're going to relate to our thoughts and emotions. We may have to train our awareness to increase our sense of choice. That could be through journaling. It could be through a meditation or mindfulness practice. Maybe it's through a therapy work. We may have to put the work in to really train our power of choice. And we can access help if we need it. A friend, therapist, coach, mentor, etc. Maybe we need all of those at one time. All right. And another quote from Epictetus here. What is it that makes use of everything else? Choice. What is it that takes charge of everything else? Choice. What is it that destroys the whole person, sometimes through hunger, sometimes through a noose, sometimes by hurling him over a cliff? Choice. Can it be then that there is anything more powerful among human beings than this? So this is a pretty remarkable statement from someone who lived 2,000 years ago, to focus in on this psychological aspect like this. All right, I want to share a sketch I made in my teaching career. I often use graphics and mind maps to teach myself or to organize my lessons. And I wanted to get into a little bit of Stoic psychology. Shout out to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy here. But apparently, the key factor in the Stoic psychology is what they call the ruling factor. I guess the word hegemonikon, which was favored by Marcus Aurelius, literally meant that which guides us. Now, Epictetus preferred the term prohairesis, which basically is translated in different ways, like choice, judgment, or interpretation. I think Brittany touched on this a little bit. But the overall idea is that we need to develop the capacity for reason. As life throws those waves at us, we need to problem solve in the most rational way possible. Now, interestingly, the Stoics thought that these faculties were located in the heart. Now, modern scientists with their brain scans, and I think that Matthew Ricard, which Brittany mentioned, was one of the first subjects to have his brain scanned. They have located many of these executive functions in the brain, the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So you see my little lines there. So right behind your forehead, you can put your hand right up next to your forehead there, right behind your skull is the most evolved part of your brain where these executive decisions take place. At least there's a correlation there, right? This is called by scientists the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex. And again, it's the frontal lobes. I use the acronym RAIR, or R-A-I-R, to remember the basic functions of the hegemonikon. And so the R is for we receive impressions, right? We're getting information from the world, sensations, both inner and outer at all times. The A is assent. We can say yes or no to an experience, or we can evaluate or not. I think Stoic Dan may be touching on that more later. The I is the intention to act. So we form intentions to act on something. And then hopefully the last R is hopefully we do that rationally by weighing the evidence and using our best reasoning powers there. So a bit about Stoic psychology. All right, Ryan Holiday in the Daily Stoic had this great quote. He said, while you don't control external events, you retain the ability to decide how you respond to those events. You control what every external event means to you personally. Now, this is kind of a road of, what's that? When St. Paul fell off the horse on the road to Damascus, the Damascus moment. For me, when I really started to understand what this meant, that I could interpret events and I wasn't just sort of a slave to my habitual automatic pilot reactions. So this is a powerful, powerful realization. All right. And then Albert Ellis, who we talked about last week in Minnesota, who was the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, says, none of your experiences has any set value in and of itself. You give them value. That is your nature, to value and to rate your experiences. So another powerful statement here. And I think in philosophy, Stoic Dan's talked about this, the idea of axiology. There's a whole branch of philosophy that is the study of value and how we value things. So at every moment in life, we are prioritizing and valuing things. It looks like 44 people prioritized the Orlando Stoic today versus going outside or watching Netflix. They made those choices to improve their mind today. All right, I had to share this drawing for one of my sixth graders. So we would do some elementary brain study, and I would have my kids copy this, the McLean's brain, triune brain theory from the 1960s, where he posits that basically our brain has three basic large structures. And of course, this has been improved on in the last 50 years, but it still holds up pretty well. So in the lower part there, we have our brain stem, our reptilian brain, which is responsible for those non-conscious activities like breathing, heart rate, and digestion, things that we're not aware of on a moment-to-moment basis. Then we have the mammalian brain, the limbic brain in the center there, where we have our emotions and feelings. Our attachments are formed, right? So we have that in common with most mammals. And then up at the top, they say is the most evolved part of our brain, which is the neocortex, the rational part of our brain, the thinking brain. And this is the part that we, work on with students in school, with our own children. We try to get them to use the thinking part of their brain. And if you're like me, you're still working on the thinking part of your brain and making rational decisions. So I used to love teaching this to kids, and I think they enjoy learning about their own hardware. All right, let's move into the contemporary world. William Glasser, maybe some of you are aware of him. He was a psychiatrist and author and had a big impact on public health and the perception of psychiatrists and therapy in the last 50 years. He had a very famous book, which I would recommend, called Choice Theory, which was in 1998, which we're going to dive into a little bit. He challenged the prevailing wisdom in education and psychiatry. He was against the medical model of mental illness. He was largely against medication. Of course, he had, he allowed for exceptions for people that had clearly organic brain lesions or problems, but he was quite a little bit controversial in this respect because he believed that people's main problems were they came to therapy because they were unhappy. Surprise, surprise. And that the main problems for this, the main reason for this unhappiness was because they had trouble in their relationships. They had disturbed relationships. So his patients needed to learn how to develop better relationships and how to control themselves. So from his book, Choice Theory, he said, choice theory explains that for all practical purposes, we choose everything we do. So that's quite a statement coming from a psychiatrist, because this would probably be considered extreme today, because we have a different way of looking at mental illness now. But you can see the connection to Epictetus and the Stoics, the idea that we choose everything we do. That's quite a challenging statement. Okay, so let's look basically at Glasser's choice theory. First of all, he says we control only our own behavior. Now, it seems self-evident, but at the same time, that's pretty radical, right? He does not want us worrying too much about what others are doing. He says we get into trouble. He calls it external control, where we try to control or manipulate or coerce others, and that leads to unhappy relationships. He says we only get information from others. Okay, so if you don't like the Stoic word impression, I like this word information, that anything that we experience is really just information, which we get to decide how to respond to. Humans act to fulfill their needs. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. So as Brittany was alluding to, everyone is trying to, I guess you could even say it in terms of what the Dalai Lama says, or even Aristotle, people want to be happy. They want to be happy, but the way they fulfill those needs can sometimes get them into trouble, or they may be confused about it. He has a concept called total behavior, where he describes the difference between things that we control and things that we cannot control. We're going to get into that too in just a minute. And also, choice theory had a great focus on the present. So whereas Freudian psychoanalysis spent a lot of time delving into a patient's past or a client's past, trying to uncover those conflicts with parents, William Glasser said, you know what, we need to look at the present moment and figure out what you're doing in this moment to sustain your disturbed behavior. All right. And here's another quote from choice theory. Other people can neither make us miserable nor make us happy. All we can get from them or give to them is information. So this is a beautiful restating of what Epictetus said 2,000 years ago. All right, let's delve into this idea of total behavior. And I'm going to use the idea of meditation or yoga. We've all either been to a yoga class or maybe we've seen it on TV. So let's look at his 4 components of total behavior. So the first 2, what he calls are acting or action and thinking. So in any behavior, you're doing something and you're thinking about something. And these are 2 components of total behavior that we have the most control over. So this person here, he's sitting on a floor, he's crossing his legs, he's placing his hands together, he's closing his eyes. He has direct control over those actions. So as far as thinking, maybe he's thinking a certain prayer or a mantra or maybe a set of words. So he has direct control over those 2 aspects. The next 2 under total behavior are called feeling and physiology, which he says we have we have less control over these. So the feeling that maybe this gentleman came into the yoga class and he was very angry and stressed. Well, 20 minutes later, if he follows his routine, he's feeling more calm. He's feeling more peaceful. And maybe his physiology, maybe he went from a strong heart rate or, a stressed out feeling in his body to a calm. These last 2 might take longer to flip the switch on, so to speak. So here we have the dichotomy of control sort of expressed in this idea of total behavior. All right, and according to Glasser, we are driven by our genes to satisfy 5 basic needs: survival, love and belonging, power, freedom, and fun. Now, we may differ in terms of the ratio or proportion of these needs in everybody, but I think we can agree that most human beings need these. And the beauty of this is that we can, again, focus on what we all have in common versus, Republican, Democrat, whatever party you belong to, whatever news you watch, like Brittany was talking about. Everybody has these basic needs that we can focus on. All right, now I want to share this quote with you. It's a little long, but it's by Matthew Venata, and it's very interesting. And he wrote a book that should be read by many more people called The Good Fortune Handbook. And he is a contemporary Stoic, very humble person. I think he was in Stoicon last year, perhaps. But anyway, he has admitted in his book that he struggles with depression. Now, we talked about emotions earlier today. And emotions are one of those areas where we have less control or maybe very little control at some times. But here's what he says in his book, The Good Fortune Handbook. And he's talking about an episode of depression that he had. I decide that my emotional state is outside my control. As such, I refuse to predicate my approach to the world on my present emotional state. I fulfill all my duties, listen to and accept good advice from my wife, surround myself with good friends, and basically continue life without paying attention to my dull internal world. Within 48 hours, my chemical imbalance corrects itself. So we could spend a lot of time analyzing this passage, and depression is a very difficult topic, which some Stoics are familiar with, including myself. But here, notice what he does. he accepts that his emotional state is not totally in his control. So rather than continuing to dwell on it, he focuses on what he can control. He listens to his wife, he gets together with friends, and he chooses to shift his focus away from his internal world to something in the external world. So it's a beautiful passage, which is, shows us what you can choose even in a difficult emotional situation. All right, I want to wind up today my time talking just a little bit about mindfulness. And again, we could spend many hours on this. But the Greek word is prosoke. I think I'm pronouncing that right, and which is largely translated as attention. But these two words are kind of becoming synonymous in the world of Stoicism. And many Stoics, I know we've talked about this a lot in the Orlando group and the Minnesota group, many Stoics are interested in Buddhism and mindfulness. But the beauty of this practice, the practice of mindfulness, and I should say whether you do it formally or informally, is the ability to choose the focus of your attention in any moment. We can choose the focus of our attention in any moment. And without some training or awareness, this can be difficult. And I can remember being in my teaching career, being in many difficult moments, both with students and parents and administrators. But I was able to, after mindfulness practice and training, I was able to shift my attention, and to kind of keep me stable in some very difficult conversations, so that I was able to make things not worse, or I want to reword that, to not make things worse, which sometimes is the best you can do, right? All right. And then I'll wind up today with this beautiful passage from Thich Nhat Hanh, who many of you are familiar with. He is a Buddhist monk, a Zen master and teacher, and I believe he's still living in his 90s. I think he's living in France at this point. But he has a passage from his book, Present Moment, Wonderful Moment, called Changing the Channel. And it really spoke to me many years ago. And I think it's a powerful metaphor. So he says, the mind is a television with thousands of channels. I choose a world that is tranquil and calm, so that my joy will always be fresh. I choose a world that is tranquil and calm, so that my joy will always be fresh. So a practice that I can leave with you today, besides our breath practice, is to ask yourself from time to time, what channel am I on right now? And so the beauty of that question is it starts with just interrogating yourself in a kind way. What channel am I on right now? And then you can say, all right, maybe I'm on the irritation channel, or I'm on the anger channel. What can I do? What other channel could I be on? What other mind state could I adopt right now? Maybe if I'm on the irritation channel, can I change to the patience channel? I'm often on the resistance channel. I don't like this channel, but maybe I need to change to the acceptance channel. Sometimes we get stuck in a channel called the past, and maybe we could change the channel to the beautiful present moment, especially if we're outside in nature. Sometimes when my wife and I are on a hike, we will be outside here in Egan, and as conversations go, we'll start maybe getting into some difficult territory, maybe about children or about our future, or maybe the stress we're having on our jobs. And one of us will say, hey, let's change the channel. And we go, and we say, yeah, that's a good idea. Look at the beautiful trees, or look at the, the beautiful shrubs in nature that we see around us. So in any moment, we always have the opportunity to change the channel. All right. And then my last slide for you today is to be conscious about your actions and thoughts, so that you actively choose to be your best. And I think that's a wonderful definition of prosoke, or mindfulness. When we're mindful, we can choose the better action. All right, so I think that wraps up for me. If you can reach me if you'd like to send any comments my way. There's my email, tiverson888, or I'm on the Meetup app or website at Minnesota Stoics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Great presentation. And I do have some questions collected for you. The first one is I was thinking about that quote that you included by Glasser, "We control only our own behavior." And it strikes me as, I think that was Glasser's quote, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it strikes me as quite amazing, fascinating that Stoicism and psychology are converging on the same truth. In fact, if we look in other areas of our learning of human thought, they are converging because these are the truths behind our human existence. Am I just crazy, or is this fascinating to you too?
Absolutely. And, what I love about, and thanks for bringing that quote, what I love about that quote is like Thich Nhat Hanh or Epictetus, the utter simplicity of that. But when you get it, it kind of knocks you between the eyes that, you know what, I'm not going to try to control all the people around me and all the situations. All I can really do is control myself. And I keep going back to my classroom because it was such a training ground. But I would have a classroom of 30 to 40 kids. Sometimes half of them would be, bouncing off the wall. And I would just have to say, all I can control right now is my reaction. And so I would do that for a few moments. So that's absolutely right.
Thanks. All right. Gabriel asks, we appreciate your teaching through art interpretation. What efficacy do you feel teaching through art has?
Wonderful question. I felt so lucky over the years to use art as a teaching tool because, for one thing, the figures are anonymous, so you can kind of say what you want, right? And no one's going to get offended. But it was an objective thing that we could all look at together, and we could talk about it together. We could deconstruct it together. And I also loved it because you could express multiple viewpoints. And nobody was really wrong, unless we had a quiz about, what the date the painting was. There was no wrong way to interpret a painting. And I found that the interpretations of students could be so refreshing and interesting. And I loved it for 30 years.
Okay. The next question is from Eric. He asks, who is the portrait behind you and what is the meaning to you?
Yes, thanks for asking that. I meant to look it up. That, when I was a young art student, I copied paintings at the Art Institute here in Minneapolis, and they were very kindly to let people do that. That is a painting after the artist, I think his name is Theodore Géricault, G-E-R, Géricault, who was a romantic painter from France. And I believe, I forget the gentleman's name, but there he is right behind me there. That's a copy I made. And he was a lawyer during the French Revolution, I believe. So I've got to go back and look up his name. It's been quite a few years, but I like Géricault's work.
All right. So next, let's talk about awareness. I noticed that Stoicism sometimes has these tools or these concepts that are really eye-opening, and you can learn them in a moment, but it takes months perhaps to practice. One of my favorites was early on in Orlando Stoics. I would introduce people to Stoicism very quickly by saying, only you can make you upset. And, some people say, yeah, I kind of know that. Other people, their eyes got big. They were like, wow, big moment of epiphany. And yet these things take time to put into practice. What do you think about that practice part?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's human nature when we come up to a difficult circumstance or a frustrating circumstance, we want to point the finger that the cause of our problem is outside of us, or you made me do it, or you made me feel this way. And maybe Stoic practice, in a nutshell, it's all about pointing that finger back at ourselves and saying the difficulty is not out there, the difficulty is right here. And I think the Zen master Suzuki Roshi put it, it's just coming to me. He said, other religions point the finger up. In Zen, we point the finger back at ourselves. And I think that's exactly true in Stoicism too. The finger points this way.
All right, to adapt from another question by Mehmet, they're asking, what if you do not have a significant other or friends or family around you when you're going through depression? How to handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have taken advantage of a good coach and therapist over the years just to bounce ideas off of. So there is formal therapy. There are nowadays, of course, and I'm not up on all this, but now there are apps that you can tap into where you can text a therapist or a coach. So if you know, some people join a religious community, a spiritual community where they can talk to people about these very difficult issues. Even 12-step groups can be a good source. So those would be some thoughts that I have, but I would definitely be an advocate if you can find a good coach or therapist. If you are experiencing depression, I would highly encourage you to search those out.
Okay. A good follow-up question to that is, in your teaching career, you probably found that young people had a variety of issues in the classroom. You know, some of them have conflicts with each other. Some of them just have low attention span. How did philosophy help you deal with those situations?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the best way to approach that, Dan, is what I loved about my philosophy group. It was the one group. Now I'll come back. How about this? I'll circle back to my main, the choice. You know, most young people are compelled to go to classes. They're compelled to take notes. They're compelled to do homework. In my Stoic or my philosophy group, like your group, Stoic Dan or Gabe's group, people come voluntarily. They stay as long as they want. There are no tests. I don't think you ever called my parents to get, you know, you're never angry at me. It was a voluntary experience. So the great thing about philosophy, at least in the way I presented it to young children, was to present education as a choice. And I may be a bit radical as a teacher, but if there was ever a way to introduce, and maybe the Montessori people do this, but education is more of where the child brings their interests and needs into the situation, and it's less the teacher, you know, saying, be quiet, sit down, and then just swallow this material. So anyway.
Yeah, I can see that's a good way of dealing with it. Now, Martha asks that she wishes she had been introduced to philosophy at a younger age, and she wonders what were some of the interesting or positive reactions young people had when you've introduced them to this, perhaps from either teaching or from your philosophy group.
You know, wow, wonderful question. I guess it was just seeing the excitement. I mean, kids came to my room for this group voluntarily, as I was just saying. And I tried to have interesting questions, but often my curriculum, Dan, was one question. And we would spend an hour, sometimes several hours on one question. And then we would develop, there was an essay contest, and I'm forgetting the name of it offhand, but a national contest out of Lanesboro, Minnesota. And I would have kids, again, voluntarily write essays and submit those to that contest. But to see children take a simple thought and to dig into it so deeply was just so exciting, because none of them had to be there and none of them had to do this. There was no compulsion and no, like I said, no curriculum that they had to swallow. So just the excitement, and again, you know, kids in the lunchroom will share ideas, but it's usually shouting and the other kids aren't paying attention. So in my structured philosophy group, they finally had people paying attention to their ideas in a small group setting, and there was an adult who was at least trying to pay attention most of the time. And I think that was real rewarding for them to have someone take their ideas seriously in a smaller setting. So again, I don't know if there's any teachers out there, but if you're interested in more on that, you could always email me and I can talk to you.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. It's about thrownness, that interesting term you included. I would observe that keeping clarity in a disaster is really a challenging thing, because very often these disasters or crises that happen in our lives, they're all different. So it feels like we can't be prepared for everything. But I don't know, how do you think philosophy helps us be as prepared as we can and to try to keep calm?
Oh, great question. You know, I do every morning practice some intentions. I practice mindfulness briefly so that hopefully my default response in a crisis situation is some kind of a mental affirmation or a mindful reaction or a deep breath. But to use the Stoic idea of premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of bad stuff, when I had a real difficult situation at school, I would grab my coffee in the morning and get a legal pad out, and I would try to sketch out the situation, and I would write down my possible responses. And sometimes I would even visualize those. And that would definitely help me when in situation, I simply knew what I wanted to do and I often was able to do it. So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was a pleasure listening to you speak. And now we're going to start. It's about 2:41 Eastern Time. We are going to take a 4 or 5 minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to listen to Chris Fisher. And he's going to talk to us about the world of Epictetus.